Dallas area. So it's good to see so many teens here for the activities this weekend. We're really excited to have you here. And to honor also those of you who are graduating from high school this year, can I see the hands of those of you who are graduating, getting ready to graduate from high school? Very good. There are several here. That's fantastic. Congratulations on that. Actually, I need somebody to give me some help. I need a volunteer to help me with the sermon today. So this is there's nothing hard, nothing embarrassing. You need to be, we'll start first among those of you who are graduating from high school this year, and if you have a little bit of an interest in history, maybe you could raise your hand and we'll look for a volunteer. Do I see any hands going up? You're going to regret it if nobody volunteers. Okay, anybody, volunteer, anybody who would like to volunteer. Okay, there's a hand all the way in the back. That was the first hand I saw. If you'll come up here, please. What I have here is a voucher for something historically cool. I'm sorry, it's the lady in the back there. Yeah. Oh, disappointment. Sorry about that. This is a voucher for something historically cool, and I'm going to explain what this historically cool thing is in a moment. So if you want to come on up here and take this. And I'm going to explain the ground rules of how this works. Okay. You can go ahead and sit down. Now, the really important thing about this voucher is if you hold it in your hand until the end of the sermon, you can bring it back up here and I will give you something historically very cool. And it will be yours to keep. What's really cool about this thing that I have, it's up here on my person at this moment, is that it is really, really old. It is older than World War II. It's older than World War I. It existed before the American Civil War was fought. It predates Napoleon Bonaparte. It predates the American Revolution and America as a nation. It's older than the Crusades in the Holy Land. It predates King Arthur. It predates the physical life of Jesus Christ and the apostles. It's older than that. It's older than Daniel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. It's even older than Mr. Burnett. So this is what I'm offering. Now, remember, the number one important rule is you cannot put it down. You can fold it up if you want so it's easier to hang on to, but I'm going to check every once in a while, make sure you still have it in your hand. If you put it down at any time during the sermon, I'm keeping this really cool historical thing, okay? So it's up to you. You got to be, and those of you who are around her, keep her honest, okay? What does that have to do with the sermon? There actually is a tie-in even directly to what we're going to talk about in the sermon today, and I'll get to that when we come to the end. As I said before, we're really happy to be able to participate in exciting events like this. It's wonderful to have so many young people here. It's exciting to see you in this phase of your life, those of you who are getting ready to graduate, who are going to be moving on to the next chapter in your lives. Some of you probably getting ready to go to college or trade school, or maybe you're going directly into the workforce. And you're going to increasingly start your life as adults. When I was a junior at a master college, I had the responsibility of planning our graduation ball, and I chose the theme of the Renaissance because I was dating a really cool French girl at the time, and so I wanted to find a French theme. It worked. She married me. And I was intrigued with the idea of the Renaissance. It's a French word that means rebirth. And I thought that was a fitting theme for our graduation time. It's a new beginning, starting over, starting a new chapter in your life. And that's what many of you are preparing to do now. And that's a really exciting time. You're coming up on age 18 when legally you'll be an adult. And we hope in every way you'll be an adult by that time. And you're starting to make your own plans for life. And that can be exciting, but it can be a little scary maybe too when you think about all the different possibilities. You're having to make choices about which way you're going to go. I don't know what that was, but I'm staying away from it. Find where I was in my notes here. You're going to be increasingly taking responsibility for your decisions, and you will be shaping the rest of your life. You'll be shaping the kind of life that you have. And your parents, the adults in the Church of God, we all want things to go very, very well for you. We want your lives to be wonderful. And we're doing everything we can through activities like this, and your parents are advising you and probably have put money aside to help you in the future. They've been planning for this period in your life for a long time, and everybody's going to do the best that they can to help you. But you know also that ultimately you will be the ones who are responsible for your own lives. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 11 to start looking in God's Word, and then we're going to do something which I find very interesting. We're going to take some examples from the Bible of young people. At least they were young when God started working with them, and we'll see how things went in their lives. Ecclesiastes chapter 11, verse 9 and 10. It says there, "Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these God will bring you into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from your heart and put away evil from your flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity." It passes quickly. Youth is a very wonderful time when we're young. We have health, we have energy, we have vitality, we have quick minds. Some of those things will tend to slow down a little bit later in life. That doesn't mean we should underestimate the value of experience as compared to theoretical education. I remember taking a fencing class when I was a teenager, and I thought I was pretty good with my foil, and there was an older guy in the class, and he warned me. He said, just be careful, because youth and strength is no match for old age and treachery. So there's experience that really counts for a lot. We learn a lot through life. So although you have some advantages in your youth, don't underestimate the advantages of experience that other people have in life. And you can take advantage of that for them. So these verses that we just read here say, enjoy your youth. Enjoy the fun times. Enjoy the opportunities that present themselves to you at this phase in your life. It should be a happy time. It should be a time of discovery when you're planning and deciding what you're going to do with your life. But it also says, however, pay attention, because there are consequences to the choices you make. It says God will call you into judgment. We are all responsible for what we do with what we have. And what I'd like to talk about a little bit today are some extra special blessings that you have that you've got to hang on to. Don't put them down, just like she can't put the voucher down for the course of the sermon. And that's the illustration that we want to think about today. By living in the United States or Canada, or pretty much any place in Western civilization, you could call it, you have some amazing privileges as young people that other young people in other parts of the world simply don't have and can barely even imagine. As you probably know, I travel pretty frequently in parts of Africa and other places in the developing world, and I see what life is like for young people over there. And they don't have nearly the privileges that we have simply because we were born or we get the chance to grow up here. Many of them will never be able to get through very much schooling, formal education. The average amount of formal education for some people, some places in Africa, may be like 3 or 4 years on average. That's what a man is going to have from 5 to 7 years of education, a woman 3 or less in some countries. That's it. That's all the schooling they'll ever have in their whole lives. And they have to try to get by and make it function and earn their living and all the rest of it with very little in the way of education. Now, that may sound kind of great to you right now. Whoa, no school, that would be cool. But actually closes off so many options for them later on. And they would do almost anything to be able to go to school, things that we take for granted. Life is very hard on them. They don't have the same physical abundance that we have in this country. Sometimes they go hungry. They're not able to go to school. They don't have lots of different clothes to wear. They'll never go to a dance or a ball or in their lives. Many of them will probably never ever eat in a restaurant. It's just subsistence living for many of them. And it is very, very difficult for them. Many of them won't have any health care at all, and they'll have health problems. And if we were to compare life expectancies, because you grow up here in the U.S., you've got a life expectancy up around 80 years. And if you do, you can check this online, you look at what the average life expectancy is in some other parts of the world, it may be 50 or 60. So that's 20 or 30 years longer on average that we get to live, even in this physical life, because of the incredible blessings that we're given here. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. That's not the purpose. We don't need to feel guilty. We don't deserve these blessings, but they're a wonderful gift from God. But I would like to talk to you about blessings that are even more important than that. And that is the knowledge of God, the knowledge of what God is doing, and the fact that you can have a relationship with Him, you can be a part of the church of God, you can be a part of God's plan that's being fulfilled, and he's offering you a fantastic future. You have keys to understand life that your classmates in high school don't have, because your parents are in the church of God. Because one or the other or both of them are in the church, that puts you in a different category. You can open the Bible and understand it. Most people in the world don't have that option. So it's as if God has taken some really fantastic blessings and he's given them to you. They're in your hand right now. And what you have to do is hang on to those blessings. Take advantage of them. Realize their worth and their value. And don't discard them or put them aside because some things in the world seem more eye-catching for the moment. It seems more fun. There is no comparison to the value of God's way of life. So my question for you today is, what are you going to do with all of these blessings that God has given to you? How are you going to treat them in the rest of your life? You've got a wonderful head start. You have a wonderful head start physically. You have a wonderful head start spiritually. A priceless head start. Priceless blessings. What are you going to do with them? Are you going to hang on to them, or are you going to let them fall? Let's look at the story. I said we're going to look at the story of some young people that God started working with when they were very young. Let's look at Judges chapter 13. Judges chapter 13, we meet someone that even people who know very little about the Bible will remember the story of this fellow's life. We're talking about Samson. Now, what do you think of when you hear the word Samson? You think of some really big, muscular, super strong guy. And that is no doubt the way he was. He was one of the strongest men the Bible records. He does some amazing things. And God started working with him even before he was born, actually. There's an angel that appeared to his mother and said, you haven't had any children up till now, but you're going to have a son, and he's got important work to do for God. Judges chapter 13, verse 1. The children of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come on his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from his womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. That is quite a mission. He's not even born yet, and God says, I have picked out your son. He's got very important work to do. I have a mission for him. He's going to start delivering his nation from the overbearing Philistines, from the servitude in which they were held. Quite amazing. And God gave him this wonderful gift to enable him to complete his mission. He made Samson incredibly strong. And we read about some of the things he was able to do. I won't take the time to read all of these chapters. You can do that on your own if you like. We're just going to hit a few high points here, though. Still in Judges 13, let's read verse 24. The woman bore a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And verse 25 says, the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Mahaneh Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. The Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him. God gave him extra special capacities, gave him a sharp mind to be able to understand what he needed to do, and gave him incredible strength, which he no doubt realized increasingly as he grew up. For example, chapter 14, verse 1. Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman of Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman of Timnah, the daughters of the Philistines. Now therefore get her for me as a wife. And his father and mother said to him, is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren or among my people that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson just said, I like her. Get her for me. And we kind of see Samson's attitude here. God's giving them these blessings, and we're going to see in a moment how an incredible strength he had. And instead of marrying someone from his own nation, he goes and finds this really beautiful Philistine out there. He liked kind of foreign women, I guess you could say. But a pagan girl. She wasn't an Israelite. She worshipped idols and all of that. And he goes to his parents and said, I want her. Get her for me. That's kind of that's the way I imagine him talking. Get her for me. That's the one I want. And his parents say, can't you find there are lots of nice Israelite girls that are worshiping the true God? Pick one of them. No, I want her. Get her for me. and he didn't listen to his parents' advice. He was going to go his own way. He was going to make his own decisions and do pretty much whatever he wanted to do. We're going to see this as we go through Samson's life. He was very headstrong, wouldn't listen to advice. He just lived his life for himself, basically. He pretty much just lived his life for himself. And it caused him a lot of problems, as we're going to see. He doesn't seem to have spent a lot of time thinking about the mission that God had given him to do. We're going to see here that almost every time he used his great strength against the Philistines, it wasn't because he felt like he had this mission to do God's will. It was whenever they did something mean to him personally, then he'd take vengeance and go kill a bunch of them. But it was all about him. Me. Not his parents, not his nation, and apparently, at least through most of his life, not even God. He wasn't paying much attention to what God wanted him to do. Now let's continue reading in chapter 14. His father and mother, verse 4, says, did not know that this was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. They were in charge. They occupied the land. They could tax the people. They tell them what to do, and they had to do it. So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and he came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now, to his surprise, a young lion came roaring out against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily on him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he didn't tell his father or mother what he'd done. He had to realize at this point, there's something unusual going on here. Even if he hadn't had any burst of great strength up until that point, you think he would have noticed there's something unusual about what's happening in his life? Anybody here ripped a lion apart with their bare hands recently? That's not the thing, we don't do that. This makes me laugh a little bit because he said he did that as easily as you would rip a goat apart. Anybody even ripped a goat apart lately? Those are pretty tough animals. In my different travels in Africa, I've had a few close encounters with lions. In fact, once I was charged, I was standing on foot, and I was watching a lion off in the distance, and he caught sight of me, and he charged right at me. Right at me. I've got the picture to prove it. He was coming straight at me. And you know what they say, you're not supposed to move when the lion charges you. You stand, because if you turn and run, then you're acting like prey, and then you're dead for sure. You may be dead anyway, but at least you have a chance if you just stand there and not move. And so I told myself, don't move. You're not going to move, don't move. And the lion charged up to me. He stopped about 4 feet away from me and roared. And in spite of myself, I took a big step backwards. But I'm very proud of the fact that I managed to stand there, and by standing, and because of the electric fence between us, the lion didn't get me. But I've been around lions enough to tell you I don't put my hands anywhere near them. That's not the first thing you think of. Oh, I'd like to go pet that lion. You don't. You have no desire to do that when you see a lion on the prowl. And this lion charges, bursts out of the brush, rushes up to Samson. He grabs it and rips the head apart. And he's standing there with a dead lion on his hands. Now, what would you be thinking? What would your reaction be? A good reaction would have been, God has obviously given me strength for this mission to help free his people. But no, he doesn't even tell anybody. I don't know why he didn't tell anybody, but he didn't tell anybody. He kept it to himself. Maybe he was thinking how he could use it for his own situation. The Bible doesn't really say. He didn't even tell his parents what happened. He had to notice something unusual was going on in his life, but it doesn't seem to have changed the way he lived. God had given a credible blessing to him, and it's just like, ho-hum. He was just going to go on about his life the way he wanted to live it. Then, verse 7, he walked down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. And after some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion, and behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hands, and he went along eating. He came to his father and mother. He gave them some, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So his father went down to the woman, and Samson gave a feast there, for that was the custom, kind of a wedding supper of some sort. And so it was, when they saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him. So 30 Philistine guys show up. We're going to see what kind of people these are, what kind of people the Philistines were. Then Samson said to them, "Let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing." And they said, "Pose your riddle." Okay, it's a deal. You get to ask a hard question. If we can't figure it out in 7 days, we'll each give you a suit of clothing. So he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet." Now for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. So it came to pass on the 7th day, they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband that he may explain the riddle to us, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire." That's the kind of people they were. "Have you invited us in order to take what is ours? Is that not so? You're trying to rip us off here? Get clothes out of us? You invite us to the wedding and then you do this? Tell us or we're going to kill you and your father, and we're going to burn your house down." Then Samson's wife wept on him and said, "You only hate me. You do not love me. You've posed a riddle to the sons of my people, but you've not explained it to me." And he said, "Look, I've not even explained it to my father and mother. Why should I explain it to you?" A little bit more about his character here, kind of. She wept on him the 7 days while their feast lasted. And it happened on the 7th day that he told her, because she pressed him so much. Then she explained the riddle to the sons of her people. So the men of the city said to him on the 7th day, just before the sun went down, "Oh, we figured out your riddle. What's sweeter than honey? What's stronger than a lion?" And he knew exactly what had happened. This is the people that he's decided he's going to hang around with. He's going to marry into a family like that. He's going to hang around with these kind of people instead of doing what God wanted him to do. Did it seem cooler to hang around with the Philistines? I mean, they were the ones with the iron weapons. Maybe that made them seem kind of cool. We don't know why, but he constantly gravitated over there in places that he shouldn't have been. He shouldn't have gone. And we're going to see what the result happened finally. Verse 19, "The Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily again, and he went down to Ashkelon." Note that name, please, Ashkelon. That'll be important a little bit later. He went to Ashkelon, and he killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the change of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. Oh, this is not turning out very good. I just get married. My wife's she's already taking the other side in this, and he should have realized this is a chance to take stock and say, this isn't working out so well for me. Maybe I should listen to my parents after all. This wedding, this marriage is really not working out. But he just goes home for a while. He kind of goes to sulk, it would appear. Samson's wife was given to his companion who had been his best man. So now his wife, she's already called his wife, so they're married, but in Philistine morality, that didn't count too much. So she's now sleeping with his best friend. That's the kind of girl he'd set his heart on. And verse 1 of chapter 15, "After a while in the time of the wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, 'Let me go into my wife into her room.' And her father would not permit him to go in. The father said, 'I really thought you thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Look, she's got a younger sister. She's pretty too. Take her instead.'" Great people, huh? Aren't those the kind of people you want to hang around with? Not very good. She's sleeping with his best friend. She's obviously pretty, but unfaithful and rather sleazy, wouldn't you say? But sometimes that can seem enticing to young people. It seems kind of bad, and maybe that's kind of cool. And they're sort of attracted to it a little bit, even though it's going to end up ruining their lives later on. The Philistines had morals a lot like people in our 20th century do. Very similar. Drop down now to verse, let's see. We're in let's go to chapter 16 now. Let's see. Go back and find out where I want to be. Yes, chapter 16. So some time has gone by, and Samson goes in to Gaza. That's another one of the Philistine cities, farther down the coast. There's still a city in Gaza today, just like there's still a city in Ashkelon. The Philistine cities, there were 5 major cities, and he spends a lot of time hanging around there. Why? Why wasn't he doing his mission? Why wasn't he doing the mission that God had explained to his parents before he was even born? And he seems to be hanging around with the Philistines, and he's always hanging around with bad women. Samson went to Gaza, and he saw a harlot there, and he went into her. Now, he knew better than that. He knew what the 10 Commandments are. He knew how marriage is supposed to be. He knew how you're supposed to behave. And he's just doing this anyway. When the Gazites were told Samson has come, they surrounded the place, lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, in the morning when it's daylight, we'll kill him, because he'd already caused them problems before. Samson lay low till midnight. Then he rose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city, the 2 gateposts, pulled them up, bars and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. That is strong. Gates were huge things, made out of massive timbers and cross posts and all the rest of it. He just went up there, lifted the whole thing up out of the hinges, put it on his back, and carried it about 20 miles. Stuck it up on a hill so they could see where he'd been. Why wasn't he using that strength to free Israel? Why was he not doing what God had given him this strength for in the first place? He was just living for himself. Just living for himself. Samson knew better, but he apparently had the attitude, I can do whatever I want. Who's going to stop me? There's nobody around who can stop me from doing what I want to do. He took the blessings that God had given them, and he used them for himself. Verse 4. Afterward it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah, apparently another Philistine girl. Also, not very good character. He loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means may we overpower him, and we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. That's a fortune. Okay. Rat him out, tell us what we need to know so we can beat him, and we'll give you a fortune in money. And that's immediately what she set out to do. There was no love here. There was no respect. He was always attracted to people that had no respect for him or no love for him, because he was just very self-centered, as we can see here. So verse 6, Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. You think maybe the light should have gone on in his mind? If somebody really wanted to hurt you bad, what would they have to do to you? There should have been a clue that she wasn't really the kind of girl he should be hanging around with. But, no, he still did. And Samson said, so they go through this series of different things. He puts her off for a while and tells her things that aren't true first. And she tricks him. The Philistines are lying in wait. And they're gonna tie him up and take him away whenever they find out what the secret is to his great strength. And finally, she wore him down. He finally tells her, because she just keeps nagging him and nagging him and nagging him, he tells her about his hair. And when verse 18 says, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines and said, come up once more. He's told me all his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came up with her and brought the money in their hand. She lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man to had him shave off the 7 locks of his head, and she began to torment him. So that's what she was after all along. There was no love there. There are people in the world that will pretend to be friends. They'll let you hang around with them, especially if they're up to no good. They always like to have people like that, other people following along with them. And they'll pretend to be your friends, but they're not really your friends. They're in it for themselves. A lot of people out there in the world like that. And verse 20, she said, Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he woke from his sleep, and he said, I will go out as before and other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with bronze fetters, and he became a grinder in the prison. However, the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaven. It doesn't say exactly how they put out his eyes, but it would have been a terribly painful thing any way you did it. The word actually in Hebrew means they bore it out, so it's like something sharp. They just stuck it in there until they ruined his eyes. It would have been very painful, terribly humiliating to have that happen to you. And then they put him where they could make fun of him. And they would trot him out on special occasions and lord it over him and make fun of him and make him perform in some way for their joy. Verse 18. We just read that. His hair began to grow in verse 22. Now, verse 23, the lords of the Philistines gathered together to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God is delivered into our hands, Samson, our enemy. When the people saw him, they praised their gods, for they said, our God is delivered into our hands, our enemy, the destroyer of our land, and the one who multiplied our dead. So they're mocking him all the time. And so it happened when their hearts were merry, so they've been drinking, they said, "Call for Samson that he may perform for us." That's what he was reduced to. So they called for Samson from the prison. He performed for them, and they stationed him between the pillars. And Samson said to the lad who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them." When the temple was full of men and women, all the lords of the Philistines were there. In fact, there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who watched while Samson performed. And Samson called to the Lord, saying, "O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." See, even in this last thing that he did, it's vengeance for what they did to me. There wasn't this sense of fulfilling God's mission that he'd given him to do. He sort of did the mission. We're going to see he kills all of these Philistines, but it was almost as kind of an afterthought or by accident. And God worked it out that way. God's will be done. It will be done in your life. It will be done in my life. But we can either cooperate and participate wholeheartedly and have the blessings that God wants to give us, or we can do it the hard way. Samson chose to do it the hard way. And it was a very hard life and not nearly as long as it could have been. So Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines," verse 30. And he pushed with all his might, and the temple fell on the lords and all the people who were killed in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than he had killed in his life. He killed those 3,000. With the strength that he had, he could have decimated the Philistine army. He could have scoured the country of Philistines. But he didn't. He spent his life on himself, focused on himself. And sort of by accident, or through God's will, God would maneuver things around where he would end up wreaking some havoc on the Philistines. But it would appear that his motivation was mostly about himself. People that he killed in his death were more than he killed in his life. Now, before we get too hard on Samson, he is mentioned in the roll call of faith in Hebrews. So he was an example of faith. Apparently it came rather late in his life, but God mentions him among those who were people of faith, who set examples of faith. But he had a really hard life getting there, didn't he? Because he was very self-centered, wouldn't take advice. He had to go the hard way. See, Samson took all of these wonderful blessings that God had given him, and he used them on himself. To put it in today's terms, it would appear Samson lived to party. Just good times. Whatever, beautiful girls, he could have it all. He was strong, he could do whatever he wanted. And that's apparently mostly how he lived his life. He got in with the wrong crowd. He hung around with the wrong kind of girls. He hung around with the wrong kind of guys. And it cost him his eyes, his freedom, and his life, ultimately. His life could have been very different. He could have lived his life differently, used his strength differently, and had a whole different ending to his life. Good choices in life pay off. Bad choices in life cost you. And it doesn't matter who you are. Nobody gets out of that. Nobody escapes that rule, not even judges of God. They make bad choices, they get bad results. Statistically, I don't know most of the young people, I don't know you here, some of you I do, but statistically speaking, we can safely say that out of the crop of young people, the teens who are here, some of you are going to really shine in your lives. You're going to do amazing things. And sad to say, based on past experience, I would have to say probably some of you are going to make some really catastrophic decisions. And you're going to have to deal with the events and the results of those for a long time. Now, there are ways to really reduce the chance of doing that, of making really catastrophic wrong decisions. And we're going to talk about that more as we get farther along in the sermon. But just based on past history, out of this group will come some triumphs and probably some tragedies as well. Because even though you know these things, and even though we're reminded of them regularly, some people probably just aren't going to listen. And they're going to be attracted by the Philistines out there. And there are a lot of Philistines out there right now. As I think back on my high school graduating class, that's pretty much what happened with the friends that I've more or less kept in touch with over the years. Some of them turned out to be great successes in life, at least as people count success apart from God. And some of them are behind bars. Some of them are dead already. Some of them didn't even make it out of their teens before they were killed in car accidents because they drank and drove one of my best friends from high school is turned into a pundit out in Washington. He appears on C-SPAN regularly. He worked for the Congressional Budget Office for a while, and he advises, he works for a think tank. So see him on television every once in a while. Not that I watch C-SPAN that often, but I know that he's on there. Another one of my good high school buddies was, he's an architect, very successful architect. They had nice wives, great kids, pretty good lives. But I can think of other people that I went to high school with turned out very different. In fact, the girl who was chosen to be our prom queen in my high school, shortly before the prom, she made a quick trip down to Mexico to have an abortion because she didn't want to wear a maternity dress to the ball. And her first marriage ended in a messy divorce. It was a very unpleasant, and I lost contact with her after that. We didn't stay in touch, so I don't know how many more times she's been married or whatever else. But she was a beautiful, popular girl, the girl that every other girl kind of wanted to be. But she made bad choices, and she didn't escape from the results of those bad choices. I can remember a girl that came to a church camp some years ago. She was a pretty girl, she was bright, a lot of potential, but she just had an attitude of nobody was going to tell her what to do. She wouldn't obey the rules at camp. We finally had to send her home from camp. Because although camp was a great place and lots of fun, she just didn't want to have any rules. Nobody's going to tell her how to live her life or what she was going to do. You can't tell me not to do something. That was her attitude. We had to send her home from camp. And she quit going to church as soon as she could, and she went out with the Philistines. And she got into drugs. She ended up sleeping with boys who would give her drugs, and she got AIDS. And her life has been a real mess since then. She's still alive, barely. It's almost killed her several times. She takes one of these cocktails of drugs all the time to try to keep the AIDS virus down. Her life could have been totally different. She had a lot going for her to start with, but she made some really, really bad decisions. She wouldn't listen to advice. She wouldn't be guided by God's word. She was just going to do things on her own terms, the way she wanted to do it. And the results really weren't good. Hang on to your voucher, young people. God has given you amazing blessings and wonderful knowledge about how to live your life and succeed in it. It's in your hand. Hang on to it. Now let's take another example. Example of Samson is very striking, but it's a little depressing, isn't it? Not the best way to live your life. But there was another example just a few years after Samson, born in the same general area. Also a young man that God began working with, very young in his life. But his life turned out very differently. 1 Kings chapter 17. 1 Kings chapter 17. I'm sorry, I said Kings. I meant Samuel. 1 Samuel 17. David, you know the story. You can read it in the previous chapters when you have the time to do that. He was the youngest boy in the family. He had some big, strapping brothers who looked like the kind that you would pick to make king. And when Samuel came and he told David's father, one of your sons is going to be king, who did he bring out first? He brought out the oldest one, this big, strong, handsome guy, somebody who looked like a king. And Samuel said, no, he's not the one. Oh, it must be the second one. No, it's not him either. And he brings well, that's all there is. Well, don't you have any more sons? Well, there's David, but I mean, he's the youngest one, and he's not tall like they are, and surely you don't want the young. Yeah, that's the one God has chosen. So God already knew about David's character ahead of time. He had him anointed king when he was very young. He was anointed to be king, although he didn't actually become king for quite a while. But God was already aware of his character. He was aware of decisions he was making. He was aware of the way he lived his life, what was important to him and what wasn't important to him. And he was chosen for this post, just like Samson had been chosen early on. But you're going to see David reacted very differently. So David goes down. He's left at home with his father to take care of the chores on the farm, while his brothers joined the Israelite militia. They didn't really have a standing army. Whenever there's danger, sort of everybody grabbed whatever they had, whatever sort of implements they had, and they all went down and had a big fight. And the armies are lining up face to face against each other, and David is sent by his father to take some food down to his brothers. The Philistines gathered the armies together to battle, and they were gathered, this is verse 1 of 1 Samuel 17, toward Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim, and Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. We know exactly where that place is. The Valley of Elah is still called the Valley of Elah, not very far from Jerusalem. I've actually driven through it a couple of times. It's quite fascinating to go and see the place where this event occurred. And no, this is the spot. It had to be within like half a mile of here. This is where it would be. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side. Israel stood on the mountain on the other side with the valley between them. And the champions went out from the camp of the Philippines. I keep calling them the Philippines. I don't know why I'm doing that. Must be talking too fast. Got to get out of Asia. The camp of the Philistines, his name was Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. This is a shade over 9 feet. That's pretty big, wouldn't you agree? 9 feet. I mean, he would make the guys in the NBA look short. And he was a man of war. He was a big, muscular dude, 9 feet tall, full armor, practicing war from the time of his youth. And he comes out and he says, come on, send out the best you got. I'll take him on. And the Israelites are just kind of, I'm not going out there. Nobody's going out there. Even Saul, the king, who was a head taller than most everybody else there, he was probably the biggest, tallest guy they had. Saul wasn't going out there. He was scary. Goliath was scary. And it talks about how heavy his armor weighed. It would be difficult for other people just to walk around, carry that stuff. And he's wearing it out to battle. And so David tries to encourage the guys, encourage somebody in the army. You've got to do something. Stand up to this guy. So verse 26, David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? Imagine, guys, if you kill him, you're going to be a hero. Come on, somebody go do this. You can take him. God's on our side. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? See, that was what was important to David. David's focus was on God and what God was doing and God's people and what their needs were. This guy is defying God. We can't let that happen. Somebody do something. And, of course, nobody was willing to do it. So David was willing to do it himself. He goes to see Saul and he says, okay, nobody else is willing to do this. I'll do it. Somebody's got to do this. And Saul was no doubt very shocked. He said, you're just a boy. And David said, well, I've defended my flocks before. A lion would come, a bear would come, and I killed them. I stood up to them and did it. And it was God's help that allowed me to do it. So if God can help me do that, he can help with anything. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the bear and the mouth of the lion will deliver me from this uncircumcised Philistine. Chapter 17, verse 41. Verse 42, when the Philistine looked about, so he's looking around and then maybe he looked down and here's this short teenager in front of him. He saw David, he disdained him. Are you kidding? That's the best you can field? You're sending a boy? Because he was but a youth, looked very young. Ruddy, kind of a reddish, maybe he was red-haired, or maybe he had light skin, kind of pinkish. But he was good looking, and the Philistine said to David, am I a dog? You're coming out here with a shepherd's staff? That's all? You're going to come out and fight me with that? You coming out to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. You ever had a really big guy curse you out, shouting at you, yelling at you? Now imagine he's 9 feet tall, carrying swords and spears, and you're wearing street clothes, and you've got a staff and a sling and a few small rocks. You would have to take some courage to stand up to that. And the Philistine said, okay, come here, little boy. I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with sword and a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camps of the Philistine to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the field, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. That's pretty tough talk. He's standing up to this giant, and he said, yeah, I'm small, but it's God who gives the victory, and I'm a servant of that God. And you know the story. Off came Goliath's head. David hit him in the forehead with a stone. He fell. David didn't even have a sword, so he ran and pulled Goliath's sword out of its sheath and chopped his head off. And you know, I bet there was a stunned silence on both sides, where people are rubbing their eyes. Did I just see what I think I saw? David, the boy, killed the giant? Because David had his priorities right. It wasn't about him. It was about serving God. It was about fulfilling the mission that God had given him to do. It was about serving the people of God. And because he was focused on serving others and fulfilling God's plan in his life, he ended up having all the things that people would sometimes set out to seek for themselves. David ended up king, wealthy, powerful. He respected, loved. He had the things that most people seek, but God gave them to him because his priorities were correct. He was a great warrior like Samson, but he was doing it for the right reasons. He wanted to fulfill God's purpose. He wanted to work for the good of others, not just be centered on himself. David had a very respectful attitude. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. Even Saul, who went crazy finally, Saul became afraid of David because he behaved so wisely all the time. And it frightened Saul because he didn't always behave that way himself. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1. It happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines, it was told him, saying, "Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." And Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel, went to seek David and his men in the rocks of the wild goats. That place is still there, by the way, too, En-Gedi. There's a spring that runs down it. You can swim in those springs if you're ever over there. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the caves. Then the men of David said to him, "This is the day which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hands, and you may do to him whatever seems good to you." And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. And after it happened, David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. He was very respectful of God and his servants. Even this guy who's trying to kill him, he was the king. And he wanted to be careful to be respectful. And his conscience bothered him that he'd even shown this sign of disrespect. So it was someone, he had a great respect for what God was doing. That was always an important thing in his life. 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. After the death of Saul, finally all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and spoke, saying, "Indeed, we are your bone and your flesh. In time past, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and brought them in. And the Lord said to you, you shall shepherd my people Israel and be ruler over Israel." So all the elders in Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. He was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. David lived by principles. You could count on him to keep his word. He was a man that pleased God. In fact, you know the famous verse about him in Acts chapter 13. You can probably quote it to me, but I'll read it to you. Acts chapter 13, verse 22. This is telling the story of Israel, basically. When he had removed him, he raised up to them David as king, to whom also he gave testimony and said, this is God speaking, "I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, who will do all my will." God said, I can count on David. He lives by principle. He trembles at my word. He wants to obey me. He wants to fulfill the mission that I've given to him in life. He doesn't take for granted what I have given to him. Now, David made mistakes. He made big mistakes. We know what happened with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite. He made huge mistakes. He numbered Israel. He did a number of things like that. As human beings do make mistakes. We all make mistakes. There are no perfect human beings. But in spite of the gravity of the mistakes that David made, he repented sincerely and humbly before God. When he was corrected on something, he changed. He repented. He said, I'll go a different way. Thank you for correcting me. I need to get back on the right path. And that's what made David a man after God's own heart. He was wholehearted, and he wanted to pursue God's will. We can't take for granted the blessings that God has given us. And we want to make sure that we also take great care in the path that we tread and the way we live our lives. Let's go back and look at a couple of passages in the Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs 3. Proverbs is especially written for young people. There's a lot of practical knowledge that will guide you and help you make right decisions about the way you live your life. If you've not done it in a while, I would encourage you to read through the Proverbs. Read slowly. Think about each one. Try to figure out how that particular proverb can be applicable in your life. This is God talking to you, giving you advice for the time period where you find yourself in life. My son, do not forsake my law, but let your heart keep my commands. For length of days and long life and peace they will add to you. These are some promises that come with God's way of life. When you embrace the blessings that God has given you, and you say, yes, I want to use them to your honor and glory, blessings follow. More blessings follow. Let not mercy and truth forsake you. Bind them around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart, and so find favor and high esteem in the sight of God and men. We have a reputation with the people who know us. When people think of you or me, they think of certain things. Well, he or she is this way. This is the kind of person he is. Someone you can count on or not. And our reputation is made up of a lot of different things. But this verse says we also have a reputation with God. And we can be esteemed in God's sight or not, depending on the way we live our lives. There's a lot of practical wisdom in the Proverbs. And God is, as we read these things, he's saying, my son or my daughter, don't forget my laws. Keep my commandments in your heart. Let me guide you. Take advice, and your life will be much better for it. Proverbs chapter 22. Proverbs 22. I love this proverb. I'll explain why in just a moment. I have a really vivid image in my mind of how this happens, and I'm going to explain it to you here in a moment. A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself. But the simple, that's Bible speak for stupid, the simple pass on and are punished. Now, you can imagine this any way you want. The way I imagine it is two guys walking down the road, and there's a ring wraith coming down the road toward them. Evil. And the prudent one says, whoa, a ring wraith. I'm getting off the road until it goes by. He goes off and he hides behind a bush. The other guy, the simple one, he just continues walking down the road. Do-de-do-do-do. Splat! He gets punished. The other guy gets off the road and hides until the danger goes by. The simple sees it and doesn't do anything about it. Doesn't want to pay attention. It's more interesting to look at the birds in the trees or whatever. He's not paying any attention to what's in front of him or what's coming down the road toward him. He passes on and he is punished. And that happens to a lot of people because there are an incredible number of people out there in the world that don't really think very much about what they're doing or the way they're living their lives or why they're living or what they're supposed to be accomplishing. They live accidental lives from one minute to the next. They don't think very far down the road. And we really do need to be thinking a lot about what we do. That's called meditation in the Bible. It just means reflect on it. Think, plan, think carefully about the way you want to live your life. And live by principle. Don't live accidental lives. Now, you've heard these things before, I know. We've all heard similar things before. We've heard similar messages, similar themes developed in sermons and Bible studies. But we need to be reminded of them. We all need to be reminded of them. Teens need to be reminded of them. Adults need to be reminded of them. We need to be reminded that we've got to think carefully and that the decisions we make will shape the way our lives turn out. Somebody once said, we don't all think alike. In fact, we don't all think. And I would submit that that's true. A lot of people out there who don't think very much about what they're doing or the way they live their lives. I have sometimes heard teens in the church say something like, I want to learn from my own mistakes. I don't want to learn from somebody else's mistakes. So I don't really want any advice from you. I want to live it all out myself. And I've heard that more than once. And I think, okay, simple one, you're going to be punished. You can walk down that road if you want. You don't have to foresee the evil and hide yourself. The road is clear. You can walk down that road if you want. But it's not really smart to do it that way. I wish you wouldn't. But ultimately, as I said, we're all responsible for the decisions, the life decisions that we make. Okay, I mentioned before that I would give you some practical suggestions on places where you can get good advice so you can avoid mistakes and avoid passing on and being punished by the evil that's coming down the road. Number one is your parents. You can count on your parents to give you the best advice that they can. They don't have any special interest. They're not trying to manipulate you. They're not trying to take advantage of you. They're not trying to get you to do something that is going to make them happy. They're really interested in what's best for you. That's not always true of the people you know at school. Sometimes they'll give you advice because they want you to do something to their advantage, not to your advantage. They'll pretend it's to your advantage, but it isn't. Your parents love you, and you can count on them to give you the best advice they can. They're not going to try to trick you or manipulate you or maneuver you around. Now, sometimes the advice they give you, you may not like to hear the way they give it. Or sometimes they may give you the same advice more times than you would like to hear it. Usually that's because they're not convinced you really heard it the first time. If you would give them some feedback and let you know, I understand. I do understand what you're trying to tell me, and I'm going to make this change, or I'm going to do this as a result of what you're telling me, they probably wouldn't repeat themselves quite so much. You may not like the way that they tell you the advice that they give you. But try to get beyond the form that it comes to you in. If it's a little annoying to you, you don't like to hear it, get beyond that and try to realize, why are they telling me this? What is the point? Why do they think this is so important that they tell me this over and over again? There's got to be something there that maybe I'm not seeing right away. Take advantage of your parents' advice. They love you more than anybody in the world, and they will give you the very best advice that they can for your good. And there aren't a whole lot of people in the world that we can with certainty say that about. But your parents, you can. Secondarily, the Bible. The Bible is God's instruction book to teach us the way of life that brings us blessings and good things. It's not entirely painless. No life is entirely painless. Pain and difficulty and obstacles is a part of physical existence. You will not escape that entirely, no matter how you live your life. But the Bible shows us the way where the troubles and difficulties that we have to confront, they turn to our good. Something positive comes out of it, which isn't always true for the people in the world. Study the Proverbs in particular at this phase in your life. Get to know them well and keep the long term in mind. Stories like the Judges and the Kings are very graphic examples of what happened when people obey God and follow His instructions and when they don't. And they're very graphic. They can really stick with us. Those stories can help us remember important things. Study the Judges. Study the Kings. Ladies, study the great women of the Bible. Learn from their examples. Study Sarah and Ruth and Esther. Now, there are other great women of the Bible. In fact, it makes a very interesting study to study Samson's mother. She's the real hero in that story, if you read the story. The angel keeps appearing to her, not to the husband. And the husband isn't thinking straight all the time, and the wife has a lot more practical wisdom about it. Read through the chapters on Samson and pay careful attention to the mother. You'll see she's really the hero or heroine in that story. It's quite interesting. So learn from the Bible. Make it a habit to read the Bible, some of the Bible every day. Read a proverb every morning before you start your day and think about what it means and how you can apply it and the kind of trouble it could save you. Also, observe the people around you. Watch what happens to them. And keep the long term in mind. We can learn a lot from watching other people's mistakes or other people's good things that they do that turn out well for them. We see somebody who works hard and applies himself, and good things are going to come his way. We see somebody else who lives a different way. We have a very graphic reminder of what the results are. So observe people. And do keep the long term in mind, because bad actions are like boomerangs. When you make a bad decision, it's like a boomerang. You know what a boomerang is? If you throw it the right way, it kind of goes and hangs around out there for a while, and then it comes back if you throw it right. It's not easy to do that. I've tried a few times, and I couldn't really do it very well. But people who can do it well, that's what happens. Well, think about that. Pretty much everything we do throws a boomerang up in the air, and it hangs around up there for a while. Sometimes they come back pretty quickly. Sometimes they don't come back to us for years. And sometimes you see people who've been throwing wicked boomerangs up there, and they just hang around up there for maybe a couple of decades. And then they all start hitting home all at the same time. Whack, whack, whack. Now, where did that come from? Oh, it's a boomerang you threw up there about 10, 15 years ago. And it's just coming back now. We want to be throwing good boomerangs. They'll come back to us also. We're rewarded according to our works. Sometimes ways of life that the Bible tells us are wrong, they can seem to work okay for a while. But the results always come. It's like the guy who jumped off the skyscraper. And as he's falling, somewhere around the 5th floor, someone inside the window heard him saying, "So far, so good." Everything seemed fine for a while. But just like gravity, the results, the results are going to come. They do come. Learn from other people's lives, not just the people around you. Learn from other people's lives. You do that by reading biographies or watching documentaries about them. All kinds of interesting documentaries on YouTube where you can learn about people who accomplished amazing things, men and women. And you learn the qualities that were necessary for them to be able to do that. I like to read biographies. I like to watch them on YouTube as well. There's an amazing amount of material out there on really motivational material about the lives of great people, successful people. Sometimes even reading about failures, people who did horrible things. That can also be a good illustration. We can learn lessons from that. We can read biographies or watch biographies of kings and queens of the past. There were good ones and there were bad ones. There are contemporary people who are still living today who have done great things, and they can be very motivating as well. We can learn a lot from other people's lives, the experience of other people. So think about your life. Get the facts about life before you make big, important decisions. Get advice from people who will give you good advice. Not all advice is equal, and it's not all good. You can get really bad advice, too. Get good advice, because you are ultimately going to take responsibility for your life. And you can get help, or you can pass on and make the same mistakes that you could have gotten out of, the same mistakes other people have made. You could have gotten out of them if you had heeded their advice and their experience. Those of you who are going to graduate now, and those of you who will be graduating in the next few years, you're getting ready to embark on the great adventure of life. And that's wonderful. The adventure of your life. You have a huge head start over almost all the other young people in the world. You have physical blessings, you have educational blessings, and you have spiritual blessings. The keys to understanding what life is all about. So take advantage of those things and hang on to your voucher. Hang on to the blessings that God wants to give you. Does she still have the voucher in her hand back there? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, she's holding on to it. Very good. All right, in just a moment, I'll call you up here, and you can give me the voucher, and I'll give you what I have something here that I think you'll find interesting. I told you how old it was. This is just a little shard of pottery. It doesn't have a great deal of, in fact, probably has no value at all, except that it's got a really, really cool story. This little shard of pottery came from Ashkelon as part of an archaeological dig that was digging in Iron Age 1. Iron Age 1 is the period of the Judges and Saul and David. So this little piece here dates to that time. It dates to about 1000 BC, or maybe 1200 BC at the latest going back. And so this piece of pottery is as old as the story of Samson and David. I mentioned earlier that it talks about how Samson was in Ashkelon. Well, that's where this was dug up. So it's no stretch to think maybe Samson saw that pot someplace. The towns weren't really that big in those days. Almost certainly some of the soldiers that went out to fight at the Valley of Elah came from that town around that time, and probably some of them handled this at one point or another, or at least saw it. So this is how far back this goes. This is 3,000 years old, and there's still a little bit of paint on the side that you can see. This was acquired legally, I want everybody to know. So please bring your voucher up, and you get to keep this. I hope that she thinks this is cool. That's why I asked for somebody who had a little bit of interest in history. If you're a little interested in history, I think it will be perhaps a little bit more interesting to you. But I hope you see my point. This is something really cool because she held on to that voucher through the time of the sermon. God has put something way more valuable than that in your hands. It's in your hands right now. You already have it. Come on up. He's put something incredibly more valuable into your hands that can guarantee you a life full of meaning, a life full of accomplishment, and it will open the door ultimately to life eternal. Don't let it go.